being here. My name's Amy Nethery. I'm Senior Lecturer in Politics and Policy at Deakin University. I welcome you to the Deakin's downtown campus for this public forum tonight. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land in which we work, live and play. The Bommana people from the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. And I acknowledge that this land is never ceded. We have a terrific forum tonight, and I am delighted to see everyone here and so many people. This public forum is entitled Public Responsibility Sharing or Responsibility Shedding, Australia's Refugee Policies in the Asia Pacific. The public forum is part of 3 days of events that we're running here at Deakin Downtown and also at Melbourne Uni, relating to a network that I'm a part of and lots of my colleagues here are part of, called the Comparative Network on Refugee Externalisation Policies, or CONREP. The partner organisations at University of Melbourne, Monash University in Deakin from Melbourne, and in Europe it's a comparative project. We have partners in Europe, the University of Bologna, the University of Luxembourg, and the University of Geneva, and I sing out to my University of Bologna colleagues who are here. Oh, they're there. Hello. So, tonight, a special lineup. What I'm going to first do is welcome Greg Barton to say a few words about the Alfred Deakin Institute and this public policy series. And then I'm going to introduce Hoda, who has directed a film that we're going to kickstart the event with. But first, Greg.
Let me repeat what Amy just said. We're really glad to see a full room like this. I'm very glad from the point of view of the Alfred Deakin Institute, we have 4 times a year in public policy forums. We have a number of public lectures, but the public policy forum is particularly around topics like this. So I was delighted when Amy said that the CONREP was putting together this workshop, and could we have something on Monday evening that plugged into this, because it's a perfect fit. It fits in exactly with what ADI is doing. Now, some of you will be quite familiar with ADI and others won't, but I wouldn't be doing my corporate responsibility and probably my career any good if I didn't say a little bit about Alfred Deakin Institute. So it's based in Deakin University, of course, here in Melbourne. We have a large campus at Burwood and other large campuses in Geelong. We use this corporate sort of location for these public events because it works well for everyone. It's easy to get to for most people. Alfred Deakin Institute is a little unusual in that it's a social science institute, so it's got a large cohort of full-time researchers and a large cohort of colleagues who are working in the faculties but are affiliated with the institute. It's unusual in universities to have such a large collection of social scientists. We also have other institutes that do applied science and medicine and engineering, but it's great for social scientists and those in the humanities to be able to come together in a space like this. We have 4 research streams, and this explains a little bit about what we're doing. One on heritage and indigeneity, one on governance, development and peace, one on mobilities, diversity and multiculturalism, and one on culture, environment and science. So very much around issues of public policy, very much about identity, what it means to be Australian, to be living here, of diverse backgrounds and identities, and what we should be doing as academic researchers but engaged in issues like this. As I said, this is a perfect fit for what we work on. Most of our research overlaps with interests here. And we hope that we can in some small way nudge things forward. We heard today that we need to try and work to change public perceptions. I think that's really critical. Much as it's very tempting as academics just to be critical of the government, and heaven knows they make that very, very easy. But we're not going to really get the government we deserve unless we help the public recognise where things have to change. And so events like this and what you're doing here tonight is an important part of that. Typically a little longer, but we've got Jeff speaking, a really great speaker. We've got a brilliant film coming up and some brilliant respondents, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Hoda Afshar. Hoda is film director, and we're going to be seeing her film tonight before we launch into the keynote speak from Jeff Twist. So let me tell you a little bit about Hoda. Hoda is a visual artist who lectures in photography and fine art. Her work has been widely exhibited locally and internationally and published online and in print. Her work is also part of numerous private and public collections. Through her work, she examines the nature and possibility of documentary image making, and she works across photography and moving image and considers the representation of gender, marginality, and displacement. Hoda, welcome, and please come introduce your film to us.
Hello everyone, thanks for having me here tonight. Sorry I'm a bit distracted. We're trying to get Behrouz Boochani connected to Skype, and this is struggling, and hopefully we will get him on the line. The film, it's I've got a few minutes to talk about the film, and then we will show it, and then I'll be around if you have any questions after the presentation. I'm happy to answer. The story behind making the film is quite a long journey that I went through, and it's made in 2018 when I traveled to Manus Island and collaborated with Behrouz Boochani on the project and a series of a group of other refugees who were detained on Manus at the time. And I'm sure probably most of you know about the offshore processing camps on Manus and Nauru that the Australian government reopened in 2013. And they basically sent all the single men and unaccompanied men to Manus, and the kids and families to Nauru. And for 3.5 years, nearly 1,400 men were caged in one space together and in the tropical heat, and after 3.5 years they allowed them to leave the camp at certain times, and then after 4.5 years they relocated them to new facilities. And 7 years later, still a large number of them remain in Port Moresby, and a group of them who collaborated with me on the project, a lot of them self-harmed so severely that they had to be transferred to Australia, and probably you know that they're still locked up in hotel rooms and are not allowed to leave the hotel after 1 year. And the work is basically I had to apply for a tourist visa to get to Port Moresby, because I knew as an artist if I applied for an artist research photographer visa to go to Manus, it would have been definitely rejected. And so I had to fake a tourist kind of profile and say that I'm going to Port Moresby after my visa was approved on arrival. I got on the next flight next day and went to Manus Island. And prior going to Manus, I spoke to Behrouz Boochani for nearly 5 months on WhatsApp, and he basically educated me about the history of the camp and what has happened there. And he organized for 6 men every day to get out of the camp and get on a boat. One of the locals helped us to get to his island every day, which was near Manus, to shoot the film and the photography project. Because when I was on Manus, I was staying with the local, but I was being stalked everywhere by immigration officers, and my phone calls were monitored. Everything we were doing was monitored. And the man who helped us, Robin and his family, they were living in this tiny little island near Manus, and they built a little house there for refugees to take a break from Manus every now and then and go and rest there. And they were so helpful in making the film. After I made the film and returned, basically what I witnessed there is something that is beyond tragedy, for someone's brain can digest that level of tragedy and trauma. And the men that I saw and spoke to, they were basically traumatized to a level that like they were dead souls in like moving bodies, you know, like they were unable to even like communicate on the most basic level. The level of depression and anxiety was so extreme. I've never witnessed anything like that. One thing that I tried to achieve in this film, through a lot of conversations that I had with Behrouz, my practice is predominantly looking at the relationship between image making and how we portray people who are standing outside the normal boundaries of our society, basically, and how the stereotypes are created and how we can challenge stereotypes through image making. How can we create images that can communicate human suffering and trauma on a different level, because I believe that the language that we use in the media has completely, we became immune to it, basically. We don't feel anything towards that anymore, to the images of suffering anymore. So it's like a search for a new language that we can communicate these issues. And the only thing that I wanted to avoid was to portray refugees as an identical group of victims sitting behind bars and staring at you. I wanted to challenge the notion of prison. I wanted to portray landscape and nature at its utmost beauty as a prison, because that's basically what it is, like the juxtaposition of the beauty of that island with the trauma and pain that these people have suffered from is the most horrific thing that I personally have ever experienced. And the question that I had when they were addressing Manus Island, which is a very sacred place to the locals, they were calling it the green hell. And I was asking myself, what happens to human psyche that we actually hate the color green, we hate the beauty of nature when nature turns into a prison. So what you're going to see in the film is an attempt to sort of like communicate these stories and narratives within that space, and also this indefinite state of like limbo, basically. But what happened was that I asked all the men that I worked with that what was the most traumatic experience that you had when throughout like your life in Manus prison. They all individually talked about the death of a friend, and how they fear that they're going to die in the island too. So when I returned, I realized that the work is about death. And so we decided to dedicate the work to 12 men who lost their lives on Manus and Nauru in the first 5 years. It's now up to 14, I think. But I'll let you watch the film, and then we can talk about it later. We need your password. I also have to say that the work is made for a 2-channel video installation piece. I turned it into one screen only. It's a combination of 2 screens that I normally show the work at, but it's just now made into one screen for the sake of the presentation.
حسین کمیل اینجا بود که کشته شد. درست قبل اینکه توی این جنگل و کنار این آبشار بمیره، برای اولین بار طعم آزادی رو چشید. سالها توی زندان بود و به یک باره خودش رو کنار این آبشار دید. حسین رو یه روز قبل اینکه از روی این آبشار سقوط کنه دیدم. وقتی که منو دید، مثل یه برادر منو در آغوشش گرفت. انگار خودش هم میدونست که قراره بمیره. اون زمان حسین 3مین نفری بود که در مانوس جانش رو از دست میداد و بعد از اون 4 نفر دیگه هم مرگ رو یکی پس از دیگری با آغوش کشیدن. توی هم رفته تا الان 12 نفر در مانوس نارو کشته شدن و حالا سوالی که بین ما باقی مونده ها تکرار میشه اینه که نفر بعدی کیه؟ صدها نفر دیگه هم الان تو دل این برزخ اسیر موندن، برزخی که پوشیده شده از آبشار و جنگل‌های سبز. اما حقیقت اینه که ما دیگه از حس رهایی و سردرگمی در این جنگل‌ها خسته‌ایم. زیبایی این جهنم سبز تا مغز و استخون و جونمون رو می‌سوزونه. تنها صدایی که باد لابلای برگ‌های درختان این جنگل میپیچونه زوزه و آوازیه که نوید مرگ میده و بس.
من نعمت هستم، 32 ساله، از استان کردنشین ایلام. الان به مدت 5 سال تو زندان مانوس مستر میبرم. من کرد فعلی یعنی همون کسی که هیچ مدرک شناسایی نداره، هیچ هویتی نداره، هیچ وطن و خاکی نداره. بعد از بارها مرگ رو تجربه کردن خودم رو رسوندم به جزیره کریسمس یعنی خاک استرالیا. ولی وقتی که رسیدیم اونجا به ما گفتن که دیگه شما نمیتونید بری استرالیا، باید بری کشور پاپوو گینه، جزیره مانوس، برای همیشه اونجا زندگی کنی. وقتی که رسیدم جزیره مانوس ما رو بردن زندان دلتا، یکی از بدترین زندانهای مانوس. تو این مدت هر لحظه هر ثانیه سایه من بالا سر من بود. شرایط خیلی بد بود، به هیچ عنوان رسیدگی نمیشد. هر مریضی هم که میگرفتی میگفتن باید آب بخوری، یعنی حتی اگه سرطان هم میگرفتی میگفتن باید آب بخوری فقط. 4-5 ماه از زندانی بودنمون تو زندان فوکس گذشت. یه درگیری، یه شروع تو کمپ‌ها ایجاد شد. شب خیلی وحشتناکی بود. اکثر محلی‌ها حمله کردن، از بیرون با اسلحه تیر شلیک میکردن و گارد تو با چوب، با چماق، با سنگ، با همه چیز بچه‌ها رو میزد. اکثر بچه‌ها زخمی شدن، یعنی بچه‌ها رو به قصد کش میزدن. اونجا به ما گفتن که یه نفر مرده ولی هیچکی نمیدونست که کیه. وقتی که صبح شد به ما گفتن که مرحوم رضا رو کشتن، گاز زده کشتن.
I'm Shamita Kanapati. I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil refugee. I fled my country because of persecution. I have been detained on Manus Island for almost 5 years. The life in Manus Island is, there is no word to describe how hard it is. We've been hidden from the world. I have seen many stuff while I'm in Manus Island. People swollen the blade, drunk the shampoos and washing powder. People refuse to drink water and no food, and people are doing hunger strike. Oh, everywhere I saw the desperations and people not talking, and I saw one Sri Lankan Tamil refugee who was mentally unwell, and he asked some mental health treatment, but he did not get any proper treatment. So he hung himself to end up his life, the more valuable human being in this planet. I feel really guilty on that. I could have done something for him to take some of his burden, but I could not do anything. And I feel really I'm a coward. How do you feel when you lost a brother or lost your father? We all human beings, we have a right to live our life with freely. But what's happening on manners? They don't care, and in fact they don't care about the men. That's the Australian policy. That's what matters. That's what's happening here.
ادریس هستم، از ایران اومدم، از استان ایران. وقتی که ایران اومدم 19 سالم بود. به مدت 5 سال در جزیره مانوسم. الان 24 سالمه، کرد هستم، استیتلس.
من آریس سیلوان هستم، 26 سالمه. موقعی که به مانوس اومدم 21 سالم بود. از ایران اومدم، استان کردنشین ایلام. من کرد فعلی ام، استیتلس هم، هیچ هویتی ندارم.
استیتلس تو ایران میگن بی هویت. تو ایران ما هیچ مدرکی نداشتیم. هر جا میرفتی میگفت تو کردی، استیتلسی، بی هویتی، نه کاری، نه بیمه‌ای، نه هیچ.
خیلی از بچه‌های اینجا دوست ندارن که آفیسرها با شماره صداشون میکنن. میگه شبیه زندانیاست. ولی من دوست دارم، چون یه مدرک شناسایی دارم. حتی موقعی که میخوامم آیدی کارتم رو زیر بالشم میذارم.
اولین تجربه زندگیم بود که از خانواده جدا شدم، اومدم مانوس. شرایط خیلی واقعا سخت، رسیدگی افتضاح تا حدی بود. یعنی هر کی مریض میشد واقعا ما حس مرگ میگرفتیم. یعنی خدا بیامرز حمید خزایی بود که یه پشه زدش، اینقدر رسیدگی نکردم، بعد نزدیک 10 روز 15 روز کشتش.
وقتی که ما اومدیم اینجا، من و رضا براتی واسه مدت کوتاهی هم اتاقی بودیم، رفیق بودیم. اما بعد مدت کوتاهی رضا براتی کمپش عوض شد، رفت کمپ مایک و من تو فوکس موندم.
دیگه هم موقع بود که شورش شد که روز بعدش من شنیدم گفتن یه کرد مرده به اسم رضا براتی.
و بدترین خاطره من از مانوس اون صحنه بود که 2 ساعت قبل مردنش اومد منو صدا کرد پشت فنس. به من گفت احتمال داره شورش بشه، هیچ دخالتی نکن. ولی بعد 2 ساعت شنیدیم که تو کمپ مایک شورش شده و بچه‌ها خبر دادن که رضا براتی رو به خط رسونه.
هممون واقعا حالمون خراب شد. من که به خصوص تنها کرد دلتا بودم، خیلی واقعا ناراحت شدم.
رضا براتی اولین نفری بود که اینجا کشته شد. بعد رضا براتی 6 نفر دیگه اینجا جونشون از دست دادن. قصه خیلی بدیه. ما خودمونم هر روز تو لیست مردن میذاریم. بعضی موقع من فکر می‌کنم پیش خودم که شاید نفر بعدی من باشم، ولی من خودم این حس رو دارم که هیچ وقت اینجا آزاد نمیشم. هیچ امیدی ندارم که یه روزی آزادیمو به دست بیارم. حتی تو خوابم ندیدم تا حالا. بیشتر وقتمون رو با گوش دادن آهنگ می‌گذرونیم اینجا. هیچ چیزی نیست، هیچ دلخوشی نیست که ما اینجا داشته باشیم. هر کی یه گوشه‌ای میشینه برای خودش با آهنگ وقت خودش رو می‌گذرونه، گوش دادن به آهنگ.
وقمري زاد بالمشينا لشميكنا ومهاوينا اسمرا خنيا نشيرينا اي وي 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 بارانا لني اقول كيلا بوكاني شو خوشنگو چند شیرین زوانی ای وی 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 بارانو منگی یک شو بودن عالم بسرین يسوع ما دالم توراوي بالبدن دوين اي قوراوي بكر من رش بدهاناوي اي وي 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 بارانو دني اقول كيلا بوكاني شو خوشنگو مهرباني ما شاء الله چند شیرین زوانی ای وی 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 بارانو
کودکی درنده شد. آخرین خبر این است. بر من اگر دندان نشان میدهم ببخشایید. من که پیشتر با گردن زنده‌ام به جنگ تیرهاتان می آمدم. این بار با خورشیدهای استوایی دیوانه‌ای می آیم که ساطورها را مذاب کرده است. من پشت سر نهادم دورانی را که نخستین کس باشم در طلوع سومین هزاره که خاک را به عذاب می درد. من اسفنجیم، در گذار باد بودم و بادم به دریاهای درنده بود. باد، همان باد که پیشترم انباشته بود، همان باد که پیشترم بادبادک کودکان کور ساخته بود و دلم را به این خواهش انباشته که مهربانی را نگین کرانه ها سازم. و اینک میدانم، نیک میدانم از سوی دیگر خود مهربانی به دهان گشاده تمساحان میرسد که پرندگان گرسنه را میبلعند. به خون فرهاد میرسد که وارونه بیستون سنگی را در خود دارد و اینک جمجمه‌ای شکافته آخرین تنبیس فرهاد. نیکان من که هنوز مهربان مانده ای، بر وجود اسفنجی من ببخشایی. من این بار از دریاهای بی‌محال باز می‌گردم، از آن دریاها که ای جلاد هرگز نیارستی. ناو بر آبش نهی و جولان دهی، پای بر من مفشار. من این بار خشم هزاران دریا را در خود دارم، دریاهایی که مرا با هزاران پیکر بی سر به کرانه آورد. پای بر من مفشار، تو را غرق خواهم کرد. کودکی در رنده شد، نخستین خبر این است. آزادی هدیه‌ای سخت، شبیه چیزی ناشناخته، پر از احساسات تازه اما مقدمه‌ای از شیرینی و پوچی مردفتن. اکنون شبیه موجودی هستم که خودش را گم کرده است، نمی‌داند از کجاست و با چه کسی پیاده می‌رود، از کجا آمده است و به کجا می‌رود. اما این دیوانه یک چیز را خوب می‌داند که دیوانه زیبا، پر از شگفتی و دستاورد، پر از سبزی جنگل‌های جزیره خیلی دور. من آن دیوانه‌ای هستم که لبریزم از شگفتی عمق بزرگترین اقیانوس‌های دنیا. این را می‌دانم که دیوانه‌ای هستم که از آسمان می‌ترسم، از ستاره‌ها می‌ترسم و از بزرگی دنیا. من دیوانه‌ای هستم که از این همه زیبایی می‌ترسم. من لبریزم از عمیق‌ترین لذت‌های دنیا، اما می‌ترسم.
left. Hoda is going to stay with us for the rest of this evening and answer some more questions that you have for her when we come to the end of this evening's events. That's me. What remains for this forum tonight, we have 3 speakers. Soon I will introduce Dr. Jeff Chris, who will speak to us about global refugee policy, where are we headed. That will be followed by, hopefully, if we can get him on the line, Behrouz Boochani, who's currently in New Zealand, and I hope that we're able to connect with him. Okay, I'm getting some positive indications, and get his thoughts and his words on the impact of Australia's policy in Papua New Guinea. And then we'll hear from Sahar, who will talk from the Refugee Council of Australia, who will talk about the impact of Australia's policies, not necessarily on the refugees, although that too, but also on Papua New Guinea society. So without further ado, let me please introduce Dr. Jeff. For those of you who study refugee studies, this clap is a good one. Jeff needs no introduction, but let me go through his bio. Jeff is a specialist in refugee, migration and humanitarian issues. He has held senior positions with the Unhcr, where he was head of policy development and evaluation, as well as Global Commission on International Migration, Independent Commission on International Humanitarian Issues, Refugees International, and the British Refugee Council. Jeff has first-hand experience of humanitarian operations throughout the world and has published, lectured, and broadcast extensively on refugee-related issues. He has a PhD in African Studies from the University of Birmingham, and Jeff is currently affiliated with the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford University and Chatham House in London. Jeff, welcome. Need you.
There are seats up the front if anyone would be want to be more comfortable. Just up along here. Just along there. There's a few just here.
Oops.
Okay, well that's a very difficult film to follow. Fantastic film, congratulations to the director, really was very, very moving. And so great to see so many people show up for this meeting this evening. I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to be with you. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, particularly in the company of the other speakers on this evening session tonight. The conference that has taken place this morning, this afternoon, and which will continue tomorrow, is looking specifically at the process of externalisation, which is shorthand for the process whereby states extend their boundaries and their borders beyond their normal territorial controls. And externalisation has clearly become a dominant feature of contemporary international refugee policy. And it's fantastic that CONREP has been able to mobilise the funding for this project and for this workshop. At the same time, I'd like to suggest that it's maybe a little bit of a mistake to look at externalisation as a process in isolation and as a discrete set of policy initiatives. So what I want to do in the next 20-25 minutes or so is to really examine externalisation in a broader and a global context, and particularly to focus on the role of externalisation in the way in which global refugee policies are developing more generally. Just to give you an impression of what I'm going to say, it's going to be a very big picture presentation. It's not going to be focused specifically on Australia or the countries like Papua New Guinea and Manus, which have just been mentioned in the film. And in order to cover all of the ground, I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through the PowerPoint presentation. I won't have the chance to go into too much detail on anything but I'm very happy to take questions and comments afterwards. So the title of my presentation is Global Refugee Policy, Where is it Heading? And I'd like to start by looking at some key developments over the past decade. Now, I've been involved in refugee work for quite a long time, and of course refugee work and the refugee field is inherently volatile in nature. But I would like to suggest that the last 10 years, the last decade, have been particularly turbulent in nature. And let me explain briefly why I consider the last decade to have been particularly turbulent in nature. Firstly, what we have seen over the last decade is widespread violence and a very widespread disregard for humanitarian and human rights law. And this has been undertaken by a number of different actors in countries like Myanmar and Syria. It's been the armed forces of the government. In places such as Nigeria, Somalia, it's been extremist groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. And in the Central American and Mexican context, it's been drug and gangs and drug cartels. So these are very different actors in character and purpose and objective, but at the same time, they share a couple of common features. One is their disregard for humanitarian and human rights law, and secondly, the growing tendency of such actors to use the forced displacement of civilian populations as a conscious strategy of meeting their military, political and financial objectives. So on the one hand, we've had this upsurge of violence and upsurge of displacement in many parts of the world. At the same time, at the political level, we've seen that the Security Council of the United Nations, the body which is being mandated to maintain international peace and security, has become increasingly dysfunctional, particularly in the relationship between the permanent members of the Security Council. And 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have actually been actively and militarily engaged in the Syria conflict. So a body which is supposed to be trying to maintain international peace and security, to prevent conflicts from taking place and to bring them to a peaceful end, those powers have actually been very much engaged in perhaps the major conflict of our times, that is the Syrian conflict. And the upshot of all these different developments over the past 10 years has been a sequence of major new emergencies, South Sudan, Myanmar, Syria, Iraq, a continuing emergency, etc., and growing numbers of refugees. And as UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, often reminds us, the total number of refugees and displaced people around the world is now at an all-time high. But at the same time, despite the number of refugees being at an all-time high, there are very few solutions available for most of them. Most of them can't go back to their country of origin by means of voluntary repatriation because of ongoing conflict and human rights violations. Most of them are not allowed to remain indefinitely or permanently in the countries that have offered them asylum and to become citizens of those countries. And the number of resettlement slots available so that people can move to another country and take up a new life there has been diminishing very rapidly in recent years. So growing numbers of refugees on the one hand, but fewer opportunities for solutions at the same time. Now, what has been the international response to this very disturbing set of circumstances? Well, I would like to suggest that the international response has been far from optimal. On the one hand, we've seen that humanitarian resources have been seriously overstretched, and we can give some indication of this simply by looking at UNHCR's budget for 2019, whereby the budget approved by the United Nations was $8.7 billion US, but the funding which the organisation actually received from donor states, and these are all voluntary contributions, the UNHCR doesn't have the right of automatic contributions, the funding the organisation actually received last year amounted to only $4.2 billion, so almost a 50% shortfall in the funding available to UNHCR. At the same time, while we have seen some positive state responses to refugee situations, here I could mention perhaps Canada, Germany, Ethiopia and Uganda are all countries which have made some progressive moves in terms of their refugee policy. In general, if we look globally at the refugee situation, we see that protection has in many cases eroded. In the global north, the predominant response to the growing number of refugees around the world has been their exclusion, and as we've been discussing here today, the introduction of externalisation policies specifically designed to keep refugees out of the world's most prosperous states. At the same time, if we go to look at the Global South, the picture is not too rosy either. Again, as I said, there are some good examples, but in general, what we've seen happening in the Global South is governments giving refugees very limited access to rights, and increasingly a pressure on refugees to return prematurely and unsafely to their countries of origin. It's happening with Syrian refugees in Lebanon at the moment. It's happening to Afghan refugees in Pakistan. It's happening to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, for example. And unfortunately, the Global South countries have, to a considerable extent, been complicit with the externalisation process of countries in the Global North. And increasingly, we see that refugees have become bargaining chips in relationships between states. A final element of the kind of somewhat depressing picture of the last 10 years has been what I would consider to be a weakened UNHCR. It's been weakened because the United States of America, which has traditionally been one of the organisation's strongest supporters, both financially and politically, has really backed out of the international refugee regime in a very significant way. UNHCR has become increasingly dependent on funding from the European Union, which of course in the Mediterranean region and in Libya particularly has very specific policy objectives. And my sense is, having worked in UNHCR for many years, looking at it from outside, I worry that the organisation has become increasingly concerned with protecting and promoting its own brand and its own reputation, rather than devoting its attention to its primary mandate, which is refugee protection and solutions. Now, one could say that on the good side, over the last 4 years, there has been growing attention to the refugee issue at the international level. There's been a whole sequence of initiatives taken since 2016 to try and focus greater international attention on the world's refugee and migration situation. In 2016, we had a UN summit in the General Assembly in New York on the large-scale movement of people, and one of the outcomes, perhaps the principal outcome of that meeting, was what was called the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, which included something called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. In 2018, right at the end of 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees was established and endorsed by most of the world states, and that was followed up at the end of last year, December 2019, by something called the Global Refugee Forum, when around 3,000 people met in Geneva to discuss the way forward in relation to refugee issues. And I was privileged to be part of the Refugee Forum, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes' time. So what are the key objectives of all these initiatives? They really boil down to 4 key initiatives. Firstly, to ease pressure on host countries. There's been a growing recognition of the fact that refugees can impose serious stresses and strains on the countries to which they go. And so the first objective of these recent initiatives has been to ease the pressure on those countries. Secondly, to enhance refugee self-reliance, rather than allowing refugees or forcing refugees to depend for years on end on international assistance. There is now a new focus on allowing refugees and encouraging refugees and enabling refugees to establish their own livelihoods, to find work and to become self-reliant. There is an attempt to expand what are called third country solutions, in other words resettlement and other pathways whereby people can seek asylum in other countries by safe and legal routes. And then the fourth objective of these initiatives has been to create the conditions whereby refugees can voluntarily and safely return to their countries of origin. Let me say a few words about these initiatives, the Global Compact and the Global Forum. Both of these initiatives have received very high praise from UNHCR. At one point UNHCR said that they constituted a minor miracle. And you can understand why UNHCR might be so enthusiastic about these initiatives, not just because UNHCR itself was a key player and the key actor in establishing these initiatives, but also because these initiatives did succeed to a certain extent in forging an international consensus about the need to address refugee issues in a more systematic manner. It was a process that brought together not only states, but a wide range of other stakeholders, including the private sector, NGOs, civil society, refugee-led organisations, faith-based communities, etc. I think the Global Compact and the Global Forum really have succeeded in shining a new and very bright spotlight on the global refugee situation. So those are all very positive developments that we've seen over the past couple of years. At the same time, and this is why I put but, at the same time I think we have to recognise that there are some quite serious limitations associated with both the Global Compact and the Global Forum. So let me quickly run through what some of those limitations are. Firstly, both these processes have been rather top-down processes, led by UNHCR and states, with other stakeholders playing a much lesser and less influential role in the process. The Global Compact on Refugees itself is an important consensus document, but at the same time we have to recognise it's a non-binding document. It doesn't impose any specific obligations on states, and it doesn't establish any specific targets. So while it calls for greater efforts to be made to increase the number of resettlement places available for refugees or increase opportunities for refugees to locally integrate, it doesn't commit any states to specific targets in any of those areas. The Global Compact was initially supposed to be a global compact specifically on responsibility sharing, but in the negotiation process that took place in the preparation of the final text, the notion of responsibility sharing was taken out of the title, and if you look at the document you will see that the responsibility sharing element of it is rather weak, in the sense that it doesn't, as I said, impose any specific obligations on states. Similarly, if you look closely at the text of the Global Compact, it focuses very much on the assistance and development dimensions of the refugee situation as it exists today, and is much less forceful, I would suggest, on the protection dimensions. If you do a simple word count of the Global Compact on refugees, which is what I've done, you'll find words like detention, deportation, asylum, reform appear 3 or 4 times in the document, but words like assistance, aid and development appear 60 or 70 times in the document. And that gives you a sense, it's not a very scientific analysis, but gives you a sense of the general kind of tendency of that particular document. And finally, there is one kind of, for me, rather worrying element of the Global Compact on Refugees, where it says that repatriation of refugees may proceed without a political solution in the country of origin. That repatriation may proceed without a political solution in the country of origin. And of course this is music to the ears of countries like Lebanon, which are very keen to get Syrian refugees to go back to their own country, even though I think there's a general agreement that the conditions are not appropriate or safe for them to do so at the moment. Similarly, one could say that with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, there's been growing talk about getting them back to Myanmar, but without a real political solution which would solve the statelessness situation of the Rohingya refugees prior to them going back. With respect to the Global Refugee Forum, which took place in December last year, it was, as I said, a very big and very enthusiastic and very energetic meeting with more than 3,000 participants involved altogether. At the same time, one of the less kind of, more disappointing elements of the Global Refugee Forum was very limited participation by refugees themselves and by refugee-led organisations. And the agenda of the meeting had been very carefully contrived, I would suggest, to focus on what it called pledges and good practices, but really, in many respects, it neglected some of the most contentious asylum issues in the contemporary refugee situation. At the same time, what I'd like to suggest in the next part of my presentation is that, having looked very closely at the Global Compact on Refugees and having sat through the 2 or 3 days of the Global Refugee Forum, I do think we can see a kind of emerging paradigm of refugee response in the way that the international community sees the whole refugee policy emerging or evolving in the future. And it's to that I want to turn in the next 2 or 3 slides. So, looking at the Global Compact on Refugees, looking at the proceedings of the Global Refugee Forum, what can we expect in the future? What is the emerging paradigm of refugee response? Here I'd like to make a clear differentiation between refugee policy in the global north and then secondly refugee policy in the global south. In terms of refugee policy in the global north, I think we can see a continuation and indeed a reinforcement of the whole process of externalisation, so as to minimise the number of refugees arriving in the world's most prosperous states, Australia of course included. And I would suggest that we are likely to see very little resistance to this process from UNHCR. We've seen it very clearly in the Libyan context, where the European Union has been instrumental in sending refugees back to that country and back to very abusive detention conditions in that country, and back to a country which is essentially at war and which is suffering from violent conflict. There's been relatively little resistance from UNHCR to that process, and I think we can see that happening on a more global basis. So, firstly, I think the externalisation process that we've been discussing here in the workshop today is likely to continue and is likely to be reinforced. At the same time, I think that the world's most prosperous states will admit to the need for carefully managed refugee resettlement programs in order to show that they still retain some kind of commitment to refugee protection and to refugee responsibility sharing. I think that donor states, the most prosperous states in the world, will also show their support for this new and emerging paradigm of refugee response by providing additional support for developmental approaches in the global south, in the countries which host 86% of the world's refugees. And there will also be an attempt to promote refugee self-reliance and to limit the need for refugees to receive long-term refugee assistance and to limit their motivation to move on from their countries of first asylum and to move towards the more prosperous parts of the world. So that's what I think is going to evolve in the next few years in the global north in terms of refugee policy. What about the global south? Here I think the focus is going to be on a number of different approaches. One will be on market-oriented approaches to livelihoods and self-reliance, and I use the concept market-oriented approaches very consciously, because I think the current approach to refugees in the global south is very much a market-oriented and, if you like, a neoliberal approach, in which refugees will be presented not as recipients of international aid, but, to use some of the current buzzwords, as resilient entrepreneurs, as hard-working employees, and effective innovators. I think there's going to be a new emphasis on the whole notion of social inclusion and cohesion. If you run through any recent or current UNHCR documents, you'll see the notions of social inclusion and social cohesion arise on a very regular basis. The practical upshot of this will be what? Well, it will be trying to avoid refugee camps, which is something that UNHCR has been trying to do in any case for the past decade. And rather than establishing parallel and separate systems to assist refugees, to have refugees incorporated into national systems, whether that be health or education or other systems such as livelihood support. And the intention of this emerging paradigm is this strategy of promoting market-oriented approaches to livelihoods, social inclusion and social cohesion, and the incorporation of refugees into national systems. The idea is it will be strongly supported by the increased involvement of development actors, particularly the World Bank. We've been talking for more than 50 years about getting development actors involved in refugee situations. It now seems to be happening to some extent, certainly more than it has in the past. And there's also currently a very great emphasis on getting the private sector much more involved in the refugee field than it has ever done before. Now, the proponents of this emerging paradigm, which you can witness in both the Global Compact and the Global Refugee Forum, the proponents of this approach would argue, I think, that it's a situation where there are winners all round. Everybody stands to gain from this emerging approach. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, for refugees, it promises a better deal for refugees. Better livelihoods, better services, improved standard of living, and improved relationship with host communities. And they are all very worthy objectives. Secondly, for UNHCR, there are also some big wins to be gained. If this approach can be implemented successfully, particularly the self-reliance component, it would limit UNHCR's chronic budget shortfall. It wouldn't need to spend so much of its money on providing refugees with their daily needs. It would also, by going along with the externalisation process, essentially reduce the potential friction between UNHCR and its key donors on asylum issues. The emerging paradigm is attractive to donor states, the world's most prosperous states, because it means reduced refugee arrivals and it means less pressure or diminished pressure on their aid budget. For host countries with significant numbers of refugees on their territory, it promises to offer them additional development aid, more support to their economy and their infrastructure, thereby enabling to cope more effectively and to benefit more productively from the presence of refugees. And finally, by talking about social inclusion and cohesion, the developing countries which host large numbers of refugees have been able to essentially take the notion of local integration off the agenda. And this is something that they've been trying to do for several years now. And most refugee hosting countries in the global south are very resistant to the idea of allowing refugees to remain indefinitely on their territory and eventually to become citizens of those states. Now, with the new language of social inclusion and social cohesion, the whole notion of local integration in the form of citizenship seems to have been very much taken off of the agenda. So that is the emerging paradigm that we see in both the Global Compact and in the Global Forum. And that's what the potential advantages of it are for the various stakeholders involved. But I'd like to suggest that there are a number of things that might possibly go wrong with this emerging paradigm. I think firstly there's a very serious risk that new emergencies will divert attention from the kind of long-term and developmental approaches that have been set out in the Global Compact and at the Global Forum. This actually happened once before. If you go back to the early 1980s, for example, there was a conference in Geneva which I attended, organised jointly by Unhcr and UNDP, which came to the conclusion that all refugee assistance should be development oriented from the outset. And that was in 1984. Just within a matter of 3 or 4 months after that declaration had been made, the massive famine across Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa happened, and states forgot completely about the long-term and developmental approaches and went straight back to short-term and emergency relief responses. And I think there's a very great danger that with the spate of recent refugee emergencies that we've seen, there might be more emergencies to come, and that will divert attention from the need for longer-term and developmental approaches. I think there's a risk that Global South states might be unwilling to remove the restriction on refugee rights and on market access that many of them have imposed in recent years. And that will be particularly a danger if the aid promises that have been made to them are not kept. If they don't get some tangible benefits in terms of development support out of the Global Compact and from the Global Refugee Forum, I think there's a very real risk that the whole notion of social inclusion will be abandoned, and it will be replaced by a new emphasis on the need to push refugees back to their country of origin, whether they want to or not, or whether the conditions are right for them to do so. The whole new paradigm is based on the notion that if you kind of keep people happy within their regions of origin, that they won't try to move to the world's most prosperous areas, including, of course, Australia. I think, again, this is a slightly optimistic view of the current global economy, and that I think there's a very real risk that global inequalities, the inequality that we see between the North and the South, will continue to drive movements from the South to the North. People will continue making their way to the world's most prosperous countries in order to escape much more difficult conditions in their own countries. And then finally, the whole new refugee response paradigm is very much based on the notion that the number of resettlement places available for refugees and what are being called complementary pathways can be expanded. And again, we have to ask some serious questions about whether that objective can actually be achieved. For many years, the United States has been by far the most important refugee resettlement country, and as we all know, since the Trump administration came into office, it's made very drastic cuts to the US refugee resettlement program. At the moment, it seems very unlikely that other states will step forward to meet the gap that has emerged as a result of the US withdrawal from the refugee regime. And so if these resettlement places and complementary pathways are not available, then it may be the fact that refugees and asylum seekers will make the decision to move by their own means, by irregular means, to other parts of the world in order to find a more secure and promising future there. So that's a fairly gloomy analysis of where we stand at the moment. Is there anything that can be done? But I think there are a number of things that can be done, and it's certainly something that we've focused on in the previous sessions of this particular conference. Firstly, there's the whole question of whether one can undertake legal challenges to the process of externalisation process. In that respect, there's been 2 or 3 kind of quite important developments just in the past 2 or 3 weeks, and I think we need as a group of scholars and activists, we need to look at the potential for legal challenges for externalisation, both at the national level but also at the international and global level. We need to look at the kind of public advocacy that can be undertaken with states, not least Australia, and a dominant theme of our conference so far has been that whole issue of mobilising public opinion against externalisation. We need to think a little bit more carefully about how that objective can be achieved. Thirdly, while UNHCR finds itself in a particularly difficult and rather weak position at the moment, I think we have to think about exerting pressure on UNHCR and actually increasing UNHCR's potential to resist some of the externalisation policies that we've been seeing. There's a need for more evidence collection. What exactly is the impact that externalisation policies are having? And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes' time. So there's definitely a role for greater research on the implementation and the impact of the emerging paradigm on refugee response that I've just mentioned. There's a whole question as to whether we can actually make use of the externalisation process to build up asylum capacity in countries of transit. So, for example, in North Africa, for example, where many sub-Saharan African refugees go, there's been a suggestion that some of the funding that's been available for externalisation could actually be used to build up the asylum systems and the ability for refugees to survive in those countries, rather than always moving on to more prosperous parts of the world. And a very important point, again, which has emerged from our earlier discussions today, is that the need to promote constructive alternatives to externalisation. It's all well and good to provide a long list of the negative consequences of externalisation and to kind of take a very negative attitude towards it. And I think that needs to be done. At the same time, as a community of scholars and activists, I think we do need to produce some constructive alternatives. And in that respect, we need to take a very careful look at the whole notion that safe and legal routes to asylum are what we should be advocating for. I think we should be advocating for them. At the same time, I'm not sure that they have the potential to achieve what everybody expects they might achieve. And I suspect that however many safe and legal routes to asylum we are able to establish in the next few years, they would never meet the demand available for refugees to move to more secure and productive parts of the world. So with that call for us to develop constructive alternatives to externalisation, I think I will bring my presentation to an end. Say thank you very much for listening. Just to give a quick snapshot.
Thank you, Jeff. Quite a different perspective from the one covered in the film, but what an overview of the last couple of years in particular, and where refugee policy and debate has moved forward. So thank you for outlining that in such a way for us. Now we have two speakers remaining, and we're going to connect with Behrouz Boochani. I think we have connected with him, is that correct? We were having a little bit of trouble earlier today, which is why I've got this questioning tone in my voice. While we are bringing the technology to us, that's hopefully going to connect us with Behrouz, let me introduce him to you. So Behrouz Boochani is a Kurdish-Iranian journalist, scholar, cultural advocate, filmmaker and author. He holds a position as adjunct associate professor in social sciences at the University of New South Wales and as visiting professor of Birkbeck Law School. He was held as a political prisoner by the Australian government in Papua New Guinea for more than 6 years. His book, No Friend But the Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison, which was published in 2018, has received numerous awards, including the 2019 Victorian Prize for Literature. Boochani has won an Amnesty International Australia Prize, Media Award, the Diaspora Symposium Social Justice Award, the Liberty Victoria 2018 Empty Chair Award, and the Anna Politkovskaya Award for Journalism. He's also collaborated with many filmmakers and documentary makers, as well as Hoda, and collaborated on the piece that you saw earlier. So we'll connect now with Behrouz, who we hope will speak for about 10 minutes and responding to this question about Australia's policies and their impact, their human impact in Papua New Guinea. Is something out there? Okay, we'll start with Sahar. I'll throw to Sahar. Are you okay to do that?
No worries, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry everybody for this the technology issues. Look, may I introduce to you Sahar, who's sitting right here in front of us. Let me go to your page, Sahar. Sahar Okhovat is a Senior Policy Officer with the Refugee Council of Australia, the national umbrella body for refugees, people seeking asylum, and the organisations and individuals who support them. Her work involves research, policy and advocacy on national and international issues impacting refugees and people seeking asylum. Sahar has previously worked for the Australian Red Cross as a caseworker and a team leader in migration support program, and later as a humanitarian observer monitoring conditions of immigration detention facilities. And I've used your work extensively, Sahar, in my own research. She holds a Masters of Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Sydney and is going to talk to us about the impact of Australia's policies in Papua New Guinea. Welcome. Sorry everyone, sorry.
That's all right.
Not yet, Behrouz.
Just a moment, Behrouz. We're just plugging you in. This is my feeling. Behrouz, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, we can hear you. Fantastic. All right, you're up on the big screen.
Yeah.
And we can hear you, so welcome. Amy, do you want to welcome Behrouz?
Yeah, Behrouz, I will welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us, Behrouz. I read your biography earlier, and people are familiar with your, in this room, are familiar with your work, I'm sure. I'm speaking to a room of about 60 to 80 people, I think. We have also seen earlier this evening Hoda's film Remain, and are familiar with that. What we're coming together to talk about tonight is about the impact of Australia's refugee externalisation policies in Papua New Guinea, and we've invited you to speak about the human impact of those policies. So I was would like to invite you to do so for about 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I would like to say hello. I think first I should mention, you would say that people in the audience are familiar with your story. I think that is a part of Australian political space and culture that is very strange. I have been writing about Australia and this exile policy. I published 100 articles and a movie, a book, all of this. But still many people in Australia don't know me or are not aware of this story. But compared to Iran, but only through the award that I received for my book, everyone in Iran know me, and that is a strange part of Australia, that I have been writing about Australia for years and years, but people didn't hear me. But only by one book and one news, people in Iran, engage with this story. I think that is strange, and how Australia is different, and how people of Australia are not engaged with politics, and that's why Australian politics is broken right now. That's why after bushfire, still 39% of Australian people support Scott Morrison. And that's why Australia has been able to keep innocent people in Manus and Nauru for 7 years and still be able to justify this policy. I would like to just talk about the whole policy first, that I already published an article about it in Guardian, that stopping the boat is the biggest lie or something like this. The headline is that. You can have access and read it. What the Australian government is saying, and unfortunately most of people in Australia already accepted this, is that we keep people in Manus Island and Nauru to prevent boats to come to our country. It is a big lie. It is a big lie. The main reason that actually they established this policy on it, the main reasons, there are only 3 levels or 3 reasons. The main reasons. First is because of political benefit. I mean, the political parties are able to manipulate Australian people because of this policy. They say that if you don't vote for us, if you don't support us, the boats attack our country. So that's why they like to keep people in Manus Island and Nauru, and it's not doesn't relate to boats on the ocean or in Indonesia or in Sri Lanka. The second reason is because of economical reason, which is corruption. They spend $9 billion on base of for this policy. $9 billion. It is a huge amount of money. And where is this money? Where is this money? I think this question should be the main question right now. Where is this money? And how did they spend this money? Of course, this money they didn't spend it for refugees. They put it in their pockets. It is corruption. It is corruption, and it is a corrupt system. And we should ask this question about a company like IHMS that has worked in Manus and Nauru for 7 years, and made a huge amount of money. You know, we should ask this question about these companies, the security companies, and how they support political parties. What is the relation between them, and how did they spend this money? That is another reason. So when they are making money, why they let people go? Why they close Manus camp and Nauru? They are making money. $9 billion. The third reason, I think, is because of ideological reason. It is become a part of Australia mentality to just exile people, torture people, and kill people, and feel happy, feel happy, feel satisfied. That is a part of Australian mentality right now, and a big part of the society enjoy to see that people are suffering because they are racist, and that is the reality of this country. We should acknowledge that. We should recognize that some part of the society are happy, they enjoy to see people are suffering. I think these 3 reasons are the only reasons for this policy, this exile policy, and is not related to the ocean. And because they have agreement with Indonesia, with Sri Lanka, and anytime any boat that comes to Australia, they send it back. And they already did this many times. And it's very easy for them to do this, but because of these reasons, they still continue to this policy. And just 2 points I would like to mention is that Australia, for this exile policy, they hide themselves behind morality. They said we exile these people because of, we want to save people on the ocean. We want that people don't die, which is a ridiculous thing. And another part of this policy is secrecy. Any time that any reporter, any media, or anyone asks them, they say, we cannot say that, we cannot share this information, or they say it is not our responsibility. We are not responsible. When people die, they say it's not our responsibility. It is PNG and Nauru. And when a country like New Zealand say that we want to take these people, Australia say no. And I think why? Because they established this policy on secrecy. They introduced this policy on base of national security. They said we do this because of national security. It is the key point and key concept. And that's why they are able to continue to this policy and do all of these crimes and still, don't care about people. And I am sure that most of Australian people want that this policy finish. That is clear that most of people in Australia, of course, a big part of the society support this, but the big part of the society are not happy with this policy, and that is clear. That is clear, but they don't care, and that's why we say Australian politics is broken. But regarding PNG and Nauru, I think I spoke 9 minutes. This policy established on colonialist thinking and mentality. They never care about people in Manus and Nauru. They never care. And right now that they closed Manus prison camp and transfer people to Port Moresby, no one talk about Manusian people. How they are suffering. No one in Australia go there, not researcher or the journalists and media, just to investigate how those people are suffering. They had a very negative impact on Manus Island. Right now 40 children remain, many families separated, local people. They damage the environment by building business, by building the prison. They cut the jungle, the forest there. Recently, just 6 months ago, I think, I had this opportunity to go back to the old prison. I could see that they destroy the jungle around the camp and around the prison, which was very sad. They and also economy. They created a fake economy in Manus Island for years, and now by closing the prison camp, now people that create many serious social problem in Manus Island right now, because they didn't replace this with different business. because many people in Manus were working in the companies, security companies there. They, made the business. They were active, So, but now, no one talk about them, and also that created a cultural problem in Manus Island, and created, actually damaged the tourism industry. And I don't think on future or forever people, be interested to go to Port Moresby and Papua New Guinea to visit that country. And that actually damaged the PNG and Nauru, international reputation, because people think that those people are dangerous, those people are wild, those people kill people. But in fact, it is Australian people that kill people. Australian government killed people. Australian government did all of those crimes, not people of PNG and Nauru. So that's why I think, we look at we can analyze this exile policy in different ways, in psychological, in historical, philosophical, about journalism, about environment, about, cultural way. We can analyze this in different ways, but I think I wanted to share something generally about the whole policy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Behrouz. That was terrific. If you are able to stay for question and answer session after Sahar speaks, would you be willing to stay online with us?
Yeah, but actually I'm cooking. Yeah, I should check and come back.
And in the meantime, Sahar will
Okay.
talk to us. Thank you, Behrouz.
Thank you. 1 minute.
No, I think
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sahar Okhovat. I'm a Senior Policy Officer with Refugee Council of Australia. Refugee Council is a national peak body representing refugees, people seeking asylum, and organisations that support them. We've been working on impacts of Australia's refugee policies for quite some time, including offshore processing. Behrouz and I have been working together, I think, since 2017. And it's the first panel where he's somewhere safe, and it's really something that we should celebrate. I just want to talk about something that is Behrouz touched on it a bit, but a lesser discussed aspect of Australia's offshore policy, and that's the impact it has on communities, on the Ruan community, on population in PNG. I'm going to focus a little bit more on PNG simply because there's more information. We are exposed to the impacts of policies in PNG a bit more. It's easier to travel. We traveled to Port Moresby in November and spoke to a number of people who were in different hotels, and some recently released from detention centres. So it was really interesting to see and be able to speak to them. PNG has a stronger civil society than Nauru, and it's easier for the reporters to actually get there. But a little bit of information that is coming from Nauru is obviously quite concerning. Quickly around Nauru, I think the main issues around Nauru is the continuous undermining of the rule of the law, and about which Australian government has been quite silent. they have been silent despite the quite ruthless treatment of the opposition MPs, the so-called Nauru 19. They've been Australian government been silent when Nauru cut the judicial ties with High Court of Australia, and effectively leaving Nauru without any judges for quite some time. So that's the situation in terms of Nauru. But going to PNG, I think one thing that started the offshore processing was that it was built on a lot of mistrust and fear and false information. I've been speaking to a number of people, the men on Manus Island and then Port Moresby, who said when they were in Lumbroom, where they didn't know the population, the local population, they were repeatedly told by service providers that they are cannibals, and then the population were told that Australians are, and that the refugees are terrorists. So this is how it started, and obviously there was a lot of tension when the population was moved to new accommodation facilities and was able to get into the towns and sort of socialize a little bit with the Manusians. A lot of those information and misinformation was debunked, but it created a lot of fear in both sides of the population. And as Behrouz mentioned, Manusians really resent the way their island was portrayed by Australian media. Everything that was coming out of Manus Island was negative, was about how unsafe it was, about all of the tensions between the population and the refugees, and all of the efforts to sort of market and present Manus Island as a potential tourism destination failed. But it's not just the impact, the immediate impact on the community. There's also the generational impact. There are about 40 kids that are born to refugee fathers and Manusian mothers. That's the official number. The unofficial number is about 50 to 60. And their future is really uncertain. Their future in terms of citizenship, in terms of their land rights. Some of the fathers have been presented with an option to resettle in the United States. What is going to happen to the mothers? What's going to happen to the children? Again, some of the fathers have been medevaced, and it's really complicated whether or not those children are entitled to any healthcare in Australia. I spoke to two fathers who had children with disability who couldn't get appropriate healthcare in Port Moresby, and they were struggling with a really complicated sort of legal question as to whether or not they can actually transfer their children to Australia, and till now they remain on Port Moresby. And one more thing that I think we should, to me, is a really good illustration of the impact of Australia's policies in PNG is how the situation around Bommana Detention Centre unfolded. So Bommana Immigration Centre is a centre that was funded by Australia, $50 million, and was built next to Bommana Jail. It was opened in April 2019. There is effectively very little information about Bommana in media. And in August 2019, a number of men were taken to Immigration Centre, and effectively they disappeared. Their phone was taken, they had no right to call their lawyers, they had none of the monitoring bodies could get in, even a local priest couldn't get in. I actually had phone calls from families who knew my name and found me on social media saying, is this person alive? Because they just didn't have any conversation with their loved ones. So that's what happened in Bommana, and there were 53 people in Bommana. Now they're released after 6 months of a treatment that there's not much scope and time to go into the details of their treatment, but it was effectively and arguably amount to torture, definitely cruel and inhumane treatment. There are two scenarios. In the Senate estimate, the Australian officials insisted that they have no visibility over Bommana. That is not Australia's operation. They did not have any say in who to choose. There were a number of men in Bommana who were medevac, and they were approved for medevac, and they were just blocked from coming to Australia. So if you go with the first scenario, that Australia didn't have any visibility over Bommana, it was just effectively this, what happened with PNG, imprisoning a number of men and preventing them from getting the healthcare was a disruption of this this perfectly constructed system that Australia thought they have. So that wasn't obviously working. Same as Nauru, where Nauru blocked a number of medical transfers. But I think the second scenario is more likely based on the leaks from meetings and based on the testimonies that I personally got from people who were released 2 days before we go to Port Moresby, that it was definitely Australia was involved. To what degree, we don't know, but there was definitely funding, there was definitely a quite substantial degree of visibility. But what it has done, it's damaged again PNG's reputation. Of course, it was PNG who implemented this policy, and it was PNG that mistreated this group, but it diluted Australia's responsibility, and Australia could hide behind PNG and say, it's not us, we don't have visibility, it's all PNG. It made all of the lobbying and advocacy impossible for us, and it's just a challenge of also mitigating the internal politics of a country that was just, at that time, the politics of PNG was quite fluid as well. It was, yes, PNG was inflicting that harm, but what about those who constructed a system that allowed for this harm to happen? And I think that's the very fact that we are questioning what was the degree of involvement of PNG, what was the degree of involvement of Australia in itself, for me, is a problem, because it's as a democratic society is eroding our right to know. We need to know what's happening. Why should we go and ask in the Senate estimates questions and get one-line answers that this is not our responsibility, this is PNG's responsibility. I think one of the main byproducts of offshore processing is just this absolute secrecy, which for me in Bommana was the biggest manifestation of absolute secrecy and this just black hole of information. So I will leave it there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to discuss them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar. That's terrific. Not many people in Australia know about Pomona and as well as developers, so thank you. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Sahar, Jeff, Hoda, if you'd like to come to the front, if you're happy to be part of the Q&A, and we'll also reconnect with Behrouz. And we'll open up the floor to questions. We have about, we're running seriously over time, but we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, so that's not very much. So can I get a show of hands if anyone's got a question to ask any of our panel members? I'll repeat questions to Behrouz. Yeah. Bill?
Yeah.
A question for Jeff. One of the things that for many years Unhcr put forward was the idea that a step forward would be to encourage countries to ratify the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol and thereby bring themselves within the ambit of international refugee law. I have a sense that in recent times that has boomeranged somewhat, in the sense that that getting a country which is manifestly ill-equipped to provide protection to refugees to sign the convention has almost become the passport by which states pursuing an externalisation agenda justify being able to shove people off into an environment where they will disappear in the dark or other terrible things might happen to them. Should we actually be much more cautious about advocating adherence to the convention on the part of states that are not going to live up to the kind of obligations that we would like to see them accept?
Yeah, can I take a couple more questions? Nazim.
Thank you all very much. My question is for Behrouz. You mentioned about after winning the literary award in Victoria that your work gained a lot of attention in Iran and people are starting to engage with your work. And I'm curious if you could tell the audience here a little bit about what that engagement has been like and how that has impacted you. And also, what are you cooking?
I'll take one more question. I think there's one more question right now. Sure.
Yeah, my question is to Jeff as well, and this is about a new development in the resettlement program from Global North around the community support program, whereby refugees who have the ability to pay to be sponsored by a member of community here are increasingly resettled initially in Canada and now in Australia, which the program has started for 2 years, and the numbers that we're getting from the Department of Home Affairs now showing that nearly 60 to 80% who have applied and paid for those programs effectively have got their visas from Pakistan, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, really making this resettlement program a priority for the ones who have got the ability to pay.
Jeff, do you mind if we get Behrouz to answer the question first and then go to your check? Behrouz, would you like to answer Nazanin's question, which was a question about the reception in Iran of your book? What form did that take and how did that impact you? And what are you cooking?
Yeah, okay. I actually, in Iran, I think the reception is very, impact on me very negatively, because people of Iran didn't hear too much about my works in Manus. And just recently they heard about me through the book, and that's why they no have idea. They no have idea, and they no have idea about our resistance in Manus Island. I mean the whole resistance that I am a part of it. That how we challenge Australia, how we fight against Australia, how we push back Australia by creating art, literature, and all of these works. They don't have idea, and that's why they look at me. It is my understanding. I think the general picture is that they look at me as a very poor man, as the victim. You know, in this way they look at me, but I think compared to Australia, they hugely engage with this story, and but they look at me in a negative way, and I think that's really so sad that people really don't know about the history of our resistance and how we pushed Australia back, and how, you know, in this story, I mean, the whole story, that my story is only a part of it. If we look at it, we are not victim under this policy, you know, in some ways. We are warriors, we are fighters, and we fight against this policy. And we change the concept of refugee in so many levels. We change the language, we change the perspective, and I think that is very different. It's very different. We challenge the perspective towards the refugees by the, you know, humanitarian organizations. So we didn't only fight against the Australian government. We actually introduced ourselves, our resistance to Australian people. We educated Australian people, but we should just think about it that really they get our lesson or not. They still look at us in, in a way that we have nothing to share to Australia. We have nothing to contribute to Australian society or not. That is another matter. But generally, I think we challenge the narrative towards the refugees. And right now, it's possible that, still many people didn't recognize this, but many people already recognize it. And that's why now I am here and I'm talking in this university. Because we change the narrative. Yeah. So, what am I cooking? I'm cooking rice with some pork. Yes.
Jeff, would you like to address the questions from the floor?
Yeah, in response to Bill, I think...
Could you use a microphone?
Yeah,
for
sure.
those with problems hearing?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'll take the question separately. In response to Bill's comments, and I think you've put your finger on a very important issue. I think for those of us who work on refugee issues for many, many years, we've just gone along with the assumption, and a fairly unquestioned assumption, that the more countries that sign up to the convention, the better. And I think, as you've indicated, we might Okay. Shall I carry on? And I think, as you've indicated, we might need to start looking at that issue with a slightly more critical perspective. Of course, we've now, I think, as you've suggested, we've now got ourselves in a kind of ironical situation where countries which are signatories to the convention but do everything they can to avoid actually implementing it in practice are encouraging other governments to sign the convention so that they can then declare those countries to be safe for refugees to live in. So it's a very kind of perverse situation at the moment. One thing that this has led me to think a little bit about, and I'm trying to write an article on it at the moment, again, for years on end, we've gone along with this notion of the fact that there is an international refugee regime, and I'm not sure that that concept holds up too well anymore. I think the notion of a regime suggests some kind of compliance, that members of a regime are willing to play by the rules of the game. And I think the notion of a regime suggests some kind of accountability mechanism, that if you don't abide by the rules of the game, then something negative might happen to you. And I think the fallacy of that analysis has been exposed by the developments of the last 10 years, as I tried to point out. So I will certainly try to argue in the next thing I'm writing that the notion of an international refugee regime is perhaps not as pertinent as it once was, and that particularly we're now in a situation where, firstly, many of the countries that have signed the convention do everything they can to avoid its implementation. And secondly, I haven't got the figures to hand, but I think if you took the figures, you'll find that a growing proportion of the world's refugees actually live in countries which are non-signatory states, and that's particularly as a result of the Syrian refugee crisis, of course, where most refugees have gone to non-signatory states. So whether you can really talk about a global refugee regime in a context where diminishing numbers of refugees are actually living in countries which purport to be members of that regime, I think is a very good question. On the question of community support and community-based resettlement, it's a great question. I think, again, if you did a little kind of poll amongst people who work on refugee issues, and you said, what is the one kind of bright development of the last 5 years in the refugee world? I think a lot of people would say community-sponsored resettlement is a very bright spot, and it's the one thing that a lot of people are clinging to with a lot of expectations. And it's certainly true, the evidence out of Canada, for example, seems to be that refugees who have entered Canada by means of community-sponsored resettlement tend to do better than those who have entered by means of the state-sponsored program. So there is some evidence in support of it. I think, again, being naturally kind of suspicious of too much enthusiasm, I think we do have to look at community sponsorship with a critical eye. And there are a couple of points which I think could be seen as more negative about community sponsorship, and I think you were alluding to a couple of them. One is there is the idea that by shifting the focus of resettlement to the community, it actually diminishes the role and the obligations of the state, and I think that's an important issue to take on board. And secondly, I think as you were very much indicating that there is a danger that while UNHCR, for example, says at the moment that refugee resettlement always takes place on the basis of vulnerability, the shift towards community sponsorship will be that resettlement takes place not on the basis of vulnerability, but on the basis of connections to people and families and communities and organisations in resettlement countries. So there is a danger that the very nature of resettlement might be changed by means of a shift from state-sponsored and UNHCR-sponsored to community-based resettlement.
We have time for one or two more questions only, I'm afraid. Kelly, and then maybe just Kelly. Yep, terrific. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you to everyone for coming today and for your wonderful insights. My question actually is for Hoda and for Behrouz. I'm really interested in the men that were involved in the project and their response to being part of the film, as well as their response to the final product. What did they think of it?
Before you answer, Hillary,
Yeah, thanks. Just to say ciao to Behrouz, we talked on Skype when I was in Bologna. We did like the Skype call to present the Italian version of your book, which I think is amazing. And so I want to ask you about what do you think about we work in a comparative network on refugee policies between Europe and Australia, and sometimes there is the perception in Australia that Europe has better policies, is more fair. What do you think about that? I mean, you write also for The Guardian, and talking about the role of images, I was impressed by the choice of the film director, which I really liked a lot, to use this kind of images. Did you have a sort of target in mind of this? Did you think more about an artistic work than to reach a wide audience?
Yeah, I think, should I answer?
Go for it, Behrouz.
I think I should answer that question that we compare Australia with Europe. Australia, I think in this policy, you cannot compare Australia with any country in the world about the policy towards the refugees. It is the worst country in the world. Yeah, without that, it is the worst policy, and it's very clear. I think we should never compare. I know the situation is very hard for refugees in Europe and other countries. I know that. Yeah, I am in touch with people. I read about them, but you cannot compare what the Australian government has done towards the refugees with other countries. Yeah, Australia, still they continue, and it is not only about Manus and Noro. In detentions in Australia now, there are many innocent people, and I should shift it to that question about the movie. Those characters in the movie, I leave it to Hoda to talk about it, but just share some information about those men in the movie. Idris, that young man who is singing, he is in detention in Australia. When he arrived in Australia, he was 18 years old, and now he's 25 years old. And he is suffering 7 years of his life in detention. Another one is Shaminda. He is in Port Moresby, he's in limbo. His friend is in limbo in Port Moresby. Only Arif went to America, and another one Nemat. He's in detention in Australia too. You know, so these people are suffering. These people are suffering, and there is not a law in this country to protect this man. There is not a law in Australia to say why did you keep this. You know, this man, they contacted me just 2 days ago. One of these refugees, he contacted me and said, Behrouz, we want to have a lawyer, you know, and you know, they cannot have lawyer, and even if they have lawyer, they cannot get freedom. You know, the law doesn't support them. So the Australian immigration minister has this power to keep people in detention, in indefinite detention, for 100 years. And they are doing this. There are many people right now in detention. They are in detention for 10 years. It's unbelievable. 10 years, and they call that place detention, and no one cares. There is not law to protect these people. Yeah.
Thanks, Behrouz. In terms of the first question, how we collaborated together, basically the time that I went there, Behrouz made it so clear that there are only a handful of people are capable of functioning on that level to be able to participate and sort of like perform for the camera and to be able to share their stories. And out of like 12 people that Behrouz invited to participate in the project, by the time we arrived on the island, 2-3 of them are like hiding basically. They were so shy and unable to communicate that I was like, there's no pressure, like let's just hang out. You don't need to do anything for the camera if you don't want to. And at the beginning, every time Behrouz was bringing a number of people for the film, we used to sit down, and I wasn't filming. We used to cook together and talk about the project, and I was saying to them that the Australian government has made you invisible and made your voices inaudible. What we're going to do, we're going to make your pictures as bold as possible, as big as possible, and put it in public spaces. And let's create poetry with images together. And I was like explaining to them that there's a series of portraits that we made in collaboration together, that we use natural elements from whatever that was available in the island. I was asking them to choose a natural element that represents their emotions and feelings best. One of them picked the sand, and he was like, sand represents the soil, soil represents the land that I'm torn from, and the land that is torn from me. He was a stateless Kurdish man, and so we threw sand in the air and we played around with it. The other one, Behrouz picked fire because fire represented his anger and also his drive for survival. And one of them picked the chicken, that we kind of like captured the chicken as like it's attacking the guy from the back. It was like the dream of freedom, a freedom without a wing that cannot fly, and it's also attacking him from the back. So we kind of like, we talked a lot for a couple of days about how we're going to approach it. And I have a methodology that I have established throughout the years of my career that I like. My major focus is on issues to do with representation and marginality, and I really believe in the language of art and beauty as a way to communicate difficult narratives basically, and how to break them basically. And so in this case, I always use like, because I started as a documentary photographer, and my work is documentary. I work with real people in real places, but I use also performance as a method to give autonomy back to the subject. So what you see in the film basically is these people, like I remember first time I showed it to one of my artist friends to give me feedback, and he was like, first of all, I'm jealous, like these guys are more good looking than I am, they sing better, they perform better, and you know what I'm saying? So you're not seeing
refugee as how we always portray them, as someone that is all they're seeking is safety and food and nothing else. You see human beings that are as talented as you and I. There's no difference here. The nakedness is a reference to the bare life, basically, a life that is stripped of basic human rights, but also because it's so hot over there that they were always topless. So it was throughout the process of making the work, it was really hard to send them video files as like full video because internet was really slow. I was sending them the bits that they were performing in, and the narrative that you hear on top is the narrative that, like, I asked them individually after I left Manus Island to sit down with their phone, tell their story to their phone as if they're telling it to a friend. And they trusted me so much that they shared so much with me, and we became really close. And up until even like this morning, I was chatting to a couple of them. I'm still in contact with all of them, and the process of making the work was in conversation with them to make sure they're happy with it. The other question, did I answer the other question?
Yes. I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
Just
you.
Yes, please.
Just wanted to, in response to Pierluigi's question around externalisation policies in Europe and Australia. I think that's why the work of CONREP is so important, because yes, the policies in Australia is bad and are being used as a model, but they are not unique. What's happening in Italy and Libya, what's happening and what happened not as systemically, but in Hungary with the pushbacks, they're all Australia's policies are quite draconian, and yes, there are people who've been in detention for 10 years. UK also doesn't have a time limit on detention, but it's just they have to look at the whole picture and see what is being happening, and also the direction that US is going is quite worrying. So I a little bit disagree with Behrouz in terms of Australia being the worst. We are setting an example and being used as a model, but there are a lot of challenging policies around the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I should say something. You know, I have been, in many countries in Europe through the events, many, and just now that I say goodbye to you, I'm waiting for Omi to call me. Yeah, we haven't even now, he is in Belgium now. Everyone are shocked in Europe when they hear about this, when they hear about this policy, when they hear about what the Australian government has done, they shocked. And I think that is a big sign, and just amazing. Someone like Peter Dutton is the head of this system. Yeah, just amazing. This fascist person, and he has power to do anything he wants. So what he's doing in the detention, to people who have voice but no one hears them, vulnerable people. There are many stories. Just an example, if I give you an example, are you aware that many refugees died in Australia in the community, and the media don't report about them, but I hear, because I'm a part of this network, I hear from the refugees community that many people died, they do suicide. So how that happened? I did research about that. They keep people in the indefinite detention for years, and they have a psychological system. When they become sure if they continue to keep this individual person in detention, he or she will kill himself. They release them in the community, and after 6 months, after 5 months, after a year, they kill themselves. And on that time, people said a person died. You know, the media don't report. They said a person died, and they don't mention that he died because of detention. They tortured him mentally for years, and now when they became sure that if they keep him more, he will die or kill himself, then it said, oh, let's release him in the community. He will kill himself. Many people died, and I call them silent death. You know, people are not aware of, what is happening on the ground is very different, very different. And just, I invite you to do research about those people who died in Manus Island and Nauru. And Christmas Island, a refugee, his name was Father Chegini. He was killed. He was killed in Christmas Island. No one is aware, no one cared about these stories, and no one, and even, yesterday was the anniversary of, Reza Barati, who was killed on 2014. Still there is no one investigates that who killed him, how that happened. There is not an independent investigation in this country. And I'm really sorry. Sometimes I talk about Australia, I'm very tough, and people feel uncomfortable, but that is reality. When we analyze this, we should talk, about reality. And that's why people, feel uncomfortable when I talk, but that is reality. And what the Australian government has done is really, it is the fascism. Just, I can say that.
Behrouz, thank you so much for that contribution. We are going to have to call the event to a close on such a depressing but sorry. We'll speak to him and thank him later. But I would like you to join me in thanking our guests, you two. And also to the team of assistants who helped connect with all the technology. There are drinks and something to eat outside, and I think they're going to kick us out of the venue soon. Thank you, everyone.